I want to thank you for coming today, and want to tell you that I've been looking forward to this presentation for a very long time. And the reason I researched this book entirely in this building. I probably researched 90% of it in this building down there in the microfilm room. How many of you have spent time down there? Okay, this is why I'm looking forward to speaking to this audience. All of you know what I've gone through. All of you know what it's like to find something and go, oh my gosh, this is so interesting. And how many of you get Tennessee Magazine? Some of you may. I write a history column for Tennessee Magazine, and I have written it for about 12 years. And as anyone who writes a history column for a magazine for 12 years will tell you, you sometimes run out of material. I'm on my 162nd column or something, and Robin, the editor, who's the most patient person I've ever met, will often call me and say, I need your column. And I'll say, when? And she goes, about an hour ago. And then I'll say, every year I'll say, I promise this year I'm going to get you about 6. And that way you won't have to worry. Anyway, so I told her that I would come down to the Tennessee State Library, and it was during like Thanksgiving break, and just research and not leave here till I had about 3 columns. And one of the columns I was going to do was a column about the very first issue of a newspaper published in the state of Tennessee. It was in the Knoxville Gazette, 1791, I believe was the year. And as I started looking through these issues, newspapers, how many pages were newspapers in those days? Many of you know, 4. 4 pages, of course, there's 1 sheet of paper folded. There wasn't much to it, except there's almost no news. It's almost entirely ads, okay? And one of the first things I noticed was an ad like this one. It wasn't this one, but it was one like this. And what is this?
It's an ad for a runaway slave.
This is a runaway slave ad, okay? Now, how many of you have looked at old newspapers and seen them? And so, well, and we've all seen them, and many of us have seen them, but I didn't really delve into it. And I had some time that day, and I remember reading this one in particular, and there was something that caught my eye, and we'll talk about this in a second, because this is one of the ones on your sheet there. This is another one that I found from the early issues. They had lotteries in Tennessee. Contrary to popular opinion, lotteries were very common when Tennessee was formed. Private lotteries were perfectly legal, which they're not yet, I don't think. And in this private lottery, the first prize was some land. Look at what the second prize was. And these are slaves. These are enslaved people. They're being given away in a lottery. Not unusual. This wasn't the only lottery that I found. Here's another ad that I found in an early issue. This is from 1795, still at the Knoxville Gazette. People selling land in what is now downtown Knoxville, they will accept cash or a slave. By the way, the word Negro means slave, okay? So slaves were almost like legal tender. In fact, in many cases, they were preferred as a way of purchasing. Okay, I became particularly interested in the runaway ads. I don't know why I did, but I decided, and it doesn't take that long to look through all these issues when the newspaper comes out every week and it's only 4 pages. It also doesn't take you that long to look through them when you quickly discover that almost all advertisements run between about 4 and 8 times. And so I started collecting the ads. 20 ads became 50, 50 became 100. Eventually I spent a lot of time down here and looked through every other newspaper, the Nashville Whig, the Knoxville Gazette, the Jackson Gazette, and I ended up looking through about 300 different newspaper titles and thousands of actual newspapers. It ended up with 906 different runaway slave ads that I made copies of. I did not include any ads that were purchased by slaveholders in other states. That's another 200 or 300. If the slaveholder was in Mississippi and bought an ad in the Nashville newspaper, I didn't include it. I also, in the process of looking at the runaway slave ads, I couldn't help but notice that there were quite a few of these as well. These are other types of advertisement related to slavery. This is one of the more simple ones and the easiest ones to understand. This is an ad for somebody who's selling 5 different slaves, all young, between 10 and 26 years old. And then what caught me on this one was the address. Okay, that could be anywhere from present-day St. Thomas Hospital to Green Hills. That's a pretty nice part of town now, and I'm not sure where it is. One of the things I will tell you is that in these days, people were very likely to identify themselves by the nearest creek or river. Roads and towns didn't have names in a lot of places, but Christian Creek, that was kind of not unusual. Okay, so much for my column. I became very interested in this, and although I eventually would write a column about this, I decided about 2 weeks into this that this would be a book. I had not written a book, a hardback book for adult audiences in about 15 years. And I thought I would write this. And my main motivation for writing it is that there were so many things that I was discovering that I didn't realize. That doesn't mean other people didn't, but I usually, as a rule of thumb, if I didn't understand this, then there probably are other people who don't as well, because this is what I do. And there were a lot of surprises along the way. And so I ended up doing an entire book, and that book is called Runaways, Coffles, and Fancy Girls, and I'll talk about the title in a little bit. But before we do that, what I'd like to do is kind of put you in the same situation I was in, and I want to ask you to look at these ads. But before we do, I want to give you a little quick primer about some of the things that I encountered that made me kind of scratch my head and go, what the? Because there are terms, there are phrases that are used that we don't use anymore, okay? And for example, I'll ask through nods or shakes, does everyone know what the word mulatto means? This is not a word that is commonly used. If you use it on a college campus today, you will be escorted off the campus and kicked out of school, okay? Am I safe to say? One of the things that made this very challenging is I had sort of forgotten just how much we censor not only what we write and what we say, but even what we think now, to the point where it's even hard to understand what was written 200 years ago. I know that sounds, okay. The phrase, my man. Have y'all heard that expression? That's my man. Okay. Go to the Vanderbilt football game, Adam Butler makes a sack. That's my man, Adam Butler. Now, I don't know that this expression started with slavery, but I do know that many ads started off with the expression, ran away from my household, my man, Bob. It's used quite a bit to describe someone who is one of your enslaved people. Interesting. I don't think we should strike it from the English language. As soon as CNN finds out about this, they'll probably want us to all strike it. And I'm not kidding. That next thing you know, it'll be banned and they'll have to take it off historic markers. But that is where I found it over and over again. This is the one that really threw me for a loop at the beginning. Apply at the printer. There are many ads that will say, for sale, a young Negro girl, fine seamstress, for sale or hire. Inquire at this office or apply at the printer. I couldn't figure out what this meant. At first I thought the newspaper was selling slaves. And then I kept noticing it over and over again. I thought, how many slaves can the newspaper own? And then eventually I bought a book that is out of print called Slave Trading in the Old South. It's mentioned quite a few times in my book, and it explained what this meant. What inquire at this office or apply at the printer meant is that if you were interested in buying that young lady, buying that enslaved person, you had to leave a note at the newspaper office that the person who bought this ad would come and get. Okay, some of you may say, oh, I knew that. I didn't know this. The person who owns who's the slaveholder would eventually come in and get the notes, and they would respond to them one at a time. First of all, this raises an interesting point. The newspapers were agents in the slave trade. All of them were, except for one called the Emancipator, but all of them were agents in the slave trade. Okay? And this is something that many people today, it never dawned on them, that newspapers were part of the institution of slavery. They're like real estate agents. Okay? They were part of the transaction. But the second thing is why? Like why not just say my name here? Why would people do that? Does anyone have any guesses? Because I didn't understand it either. Yes, ma'am. They may wanted to vet who they were going to talk to. That may be part of it. That what the book I bought claimed, and this book was written in the early 30s, was that a person who owned slaves was not too excited to inform the public that they were selling. Why? Because selling slaves was an indication that you were destitute. It's kind of like liquidating bonds. Wasn't part of the plan. And also there's possibility that they might not want their own slaves to know this. But I think that would have probably get out by the time they're running. But I think it mainly was it was kind of an indication that things weren't going well. You know, households where things were going well, like the Washington plantation, they just accumulated them over the years until one day they had 400. But that's not the way most households worked out. A fancy girl, by the way, if this presentation doesn't offend you, there's something wrong with you, okay? You will be uncomfortable, if you're not already, but by the end of this presentation. A fancy girl was an expression used for a female that had been set aside or recognized early in her life for sexual reasons, not sexual attractiveness, and would be sold as a concubine, okay? Normally, these were associated with New Orleans market because they would be used on the steamboats up and down the Mississippi, and they would make a lot of money, and the slaveholders would make a lot of money. But there was at least one slave trader in Davidson County that freely advertised the sale of fancy girls, and it was named Reese W. Porter, and he sold fancy girls halfway between here and the river, halfway between the Davidson County Courthouse and the Tennessee State Capitol, right about on Union Street. A coffle is an expression that I encountered a lot. I had never heard this expression. A coffle is a chain gang of slaves. Apparently it's still used in livestock and farming, but most people don't know what that word means. Now, what I'm going to ask you to do, y'all have the handout. I will try to be quiet for about 35 seconds and ask you to read the one in the top left and just see if there's anything in here that raises a question that you notice that's a little unusual, because I picked these for these reasons.
Is this the one you want us to read?
Yes, sir. It's the one. It's this one on the sheet.
Because the one at the top left I can't read.
Top right, yeah.
Top right.
Yeah, that one's weird. Okay, we're going to move through these quicker. Some of you may have already read these. Here's what shocked me about this one. Now, again, I read 906 of these things. It's not the descriptions of the people, although reading them may offend you, but it's going to get worse. Don't worry about it, okay? Where is Southwest Point? Does anyone know? It's called Kingston today. And in 1795, Southwest Point, it was called Fort Southwest Point because it was the southwest point of the continental United States. For just a brief moment of history, Kingston, what is now Kingston, was the southwest tip of the United States. West of Kingston it was and is the Cumberland Plateau, and then west of that, we were already here. Nashville was already being developed, or was already being settled, or whatever. To cross from Southwest Point to go west in 1795 was a pretty dangerous undertaking. You might get killed. There were many Cherokee who didn't want us there, okay? It is unbelievable that these people ran away from Southwest Point. They've never been heard from. Oh, I need to point out that in almost most cases, we have no way of knowing whatever happened to any of these people. But this is amazing. This could be like a movie. These people are running away. In 1795, when Tennessee is hardly here, Tennessee, of course, was not even a state yet. But when I saw this one, I was just dumbfounded because of how early it was. Most people don't even think about slavery being in Tennessee in 1795. But Southwest Point, if you left Southwest Point, you better bring a rifle, okay? This is only 2 years after Thomas Bigfoot Spencer was killed, just west of there at Crab Orchard. So this is very early, okay? The next one is even more amazing, and I need to recognize that you can't read it, and I'm just going to read it to you because this is also a startling revelation in terms of early Tennessee history. Committed to the goal, what's the word I'm looking at here? It's goal, but it's jail. Committed to the jail of Washington County, a Negro fellow named Nat, about 5'9" high, about 22 years old. He says he belongs to a certain Joseph Phelps of Cumberland, Muro District. He says he was going to see his wife and children near Tarboro in North Carolina, that he formerly belonged to Joseph Borden near Tarboro. The owner is desired to come and prove his property and pay charges and take him away. This is a situation where the sheriff caught a runaway. Tennessee law, this was in 1792. I've just gone back 4 years. There was no Tennessee. This is when we were the Southwest Territory. The law even then required the sheriff to run an ad and publicly proclaim this and keep the person in jail. This is what's fascinating about this. First of all, where is Washington County? Jonesboro, east of Knoxville. Where is Cumberland Miro District? Here. In 1792, this was not known as Fort Nash Borough. This was called the Miro District. Okay, that Fort Nash, that's what we really should call the fort down there. This was the Miro District. Okay, so, and then we can figure out where I don't even know, is it called Tarboro, North Carolina? Is it still there? Okay, so let's think about the geography here. Now, I don't know. What we don't know is this, and we'll never know. Did this person escape from the Miro District, make his way across the state of Tennessee, including across the Cumberland Plateau, which, as I said a few minutes ago, was dangerous, and then get arrested, and then make it all the way to Washington County, where he got put in jail? Did this person make it 2/3 of the way to Tarboro, North Carolina? Or perhaps more likely, was this person being moved? Had he been sold, and was he being moved to the Cumberland Miro District? We don't know. We can only judge one of those two stories. But this is amazing. So this is interesting, and it reminds us of something. When people came to Tennessee or Southwest Territory, the slaves were being absolutely brought with them as early as 1792, and they were escaping and trying to escape as early as 1792. Again, don't know what happened to this person. Can't read that very well, but I think the only reason I have this one on your list is because of that expression. That comes up again and again. A family of Negroes apply at the printer, and as I said earlier, that's what that means. I would like you to read this one if you can. Okay. This is actually the second time we've talked about Kingston. I think we all know where that is by now. It's in Roane County. One of the reasons that this one caught my eye is because in Tennessee today, when we look back on Tennessee history, when we think about slavery, we normally think of 2 of the 3 grand divisions. And certainly in East Tennessee, they downplay their slave heritage, because by the time the Civil War arrived, they had a much smaller percentage of slaves. This is East Tennessee, though. This ad is from 1820. Okay, and what this tells us, basically, Benjamin Cabell is a slave trader. Benjamin Cabell has brought slaves, and he has moved them from Knoxville to Kingston. How did he move them? A coffle. They're not on horses. These people are chained together, okay? They consist of men, women, boys, and girls. Men and women are probably chained together. The boys and girls, depending on their age, are probably walking alongside their parents, holding their hands. What is the current route that they would have taken from Knoxville to Kingston called? It's a highway name. It's Highway 70. That route's been there for a very long time. So, of course, it would have been a dirt road back then. So in 1870, we basically have a slave trader named Benjamin Cabell. I Googled him, searched, couldn't find anything else about the man except this. And so even in Kingston, which is a pretty small place now, there would have been a slave trading yard. It might not have been a permanent place. He might have had him in a field somewhere. But he basically is saying, I'm going to have these So, all right, this one's going to bring you down, okay? Read this one. But it also raises questions. Okay, we're about 18. I should have the exact date. It's in the book. I think this is from about 1830. What part of this jumps out at you? The description of his disfigurement. Okay. Now do get understand. I did 906 of these ads. Most of the time, there's not a disfigurement described. Sometimes there are marks described. There's always marks described of some type. But this one is a serious disfigurement. There's something very curious about it. So he has one arm, and he can read and write. Now,
High reward is what it got to be.
where does it say high reward?
$30.
Yeah, now I don't know. I will say this. I didn't study the reward amounts because I knew that would take a lot of research into inflation rates and everything. I didn't really look into that. But what I couldn't help but wonder about is, okay, first of all, how did he lose his arm? Okay, now, I do want to point out that and I talk about this at some length later on, a lot of these slaves did work in factories. They worked in sawmills, a lot of them. They had jobs that were dangerous. And so, there are things that can cut your arm off if you're not careful. Okay, but is it a coincidence that his right arm was cut off and he could read or write? I don't know. It's very odd. So, was his right arm cut off and the decision was made, well, we might as well teach you to read and write, teach you another skill or something. But this is very curious. But also, this man has made it to Canada before. Now, I've not heard a lot about how people made it all the way to Canada and then I'm getting sent back.
It doesn't say he made it to Canada before. It said he made off for Canada.
No, made. Oh, you're right. Made to Canada. I don't know what that means. Good point. That's why I wanted to show it to this audience because you're right. It made to Canada. I don't know if that means he made it all the way or not.
When I read it, I thought that's where he had it last time. That's where he's going to have it.
Okay.
And did he get his arm cut off as punishment for running away?
That's the other possibility. That's the other possibility. But we don't know.
I wonder if the reading, how does it help you finding that you know he can read and write? I think the answer probably, I'm speculating, would be you catch him, he's going to say he's free.
Yeah.
And he's going to prove it by saying, look, I can read and write. I couldn't read and write.
Yeah. Here's the thing. All these ads, these in particular, I'm showing you some of the more interesting ones for a reason, and that is because we're never going to know. I mean, you can make about 10 conclusions on this, and we will know, and all of them responsible, Or did the owner feel bad about the fact that he got his arm cut off? So I don't know. But yes, ma'am.
I was just wondering what year this was published in.
I think it was 1830. It is in the book,
Okay.
and I think this one may come up again, but it's absolutely in the book.
Okay.
And I just didn't, in the haste of creating this PowerPoint. Okay. I do want you to read this one as well. This is another one that kind of raises interesting questions. Mm. Yes, ma'am.
Do these ads get sent to surrounding areas, or is this one publication?
This one would have been published, and again, all this is in the book as to where it was. This was in a newspaper. This came off the microfilm downstairs.
No,
This-
I'm saying, would an ad just be in that local paper, or then it got distributed out everywhere? So how do
I know what you're asking. In other words, would it have been in 3 newspapers?
Yeah.
Sometimes. Sometimes down here it'll tell you, it'll say what are the newspapers it's in. And one of the reasons, I could have obviously researched this book for the rest of my life. Had to get out of here and stop. But one thing that gave me a hint that it was okay if I stopped is I was running into the same ads in other newspapers. The interesting part of this one, in my opinion, is that what was happening when these 3 people ran away. It says right there, the 3 escaped. Where does it say it? I was looking at it just then. They escaped. They were conveying to the lower country. These people were being moved from Virginia to the lower country. 1830, what is the lower country? Alabama, Mississippi, maybe Louisiana. But this is another hint of this forced migration. Most of the time the runaway slave ads don't say anything like that. They're not being moved. But this is interesting. So these people would have run away from near Sparta, which is, Cumberland Plateau, West Edge kind of thing. So it wasn't just about people in West Tennessee, okay? And some of these tell a lot of very interesting stories. Shifting gears a little bit, please read this one. Most of the 906 runaway ads that I researched don't reflect this type of skill level, but many of them do. About 50 of them out of the 906 made comments about a skill that the slave had. In this case, this was really something. Can read and write, and is somewhat of an engineer, having served in a cotton factory. They weren't all like the ones in Gone with the Wind. They're working in the fields. This guy was. Well, no wonder he ran away. If he gets north of the Ohio River, he can get a good job, okay? Has anyone ever heard of Thomas K. Handy of Franklin, Tennessee? I had not. One of the things that made me realize is I thought I knew a lot about Tennessee history. I don't know diddly squat. 99% of these names I'd never heard in my life. And I have heard of this one. Read this one. This is we're going to have to laugh at this one, as horrifying as it is, but laugh at the language that he uses. First of all, the Worley Furnace is a tourist attraction now, although there's no furnace there. That's the backside of the Narrows of the Harpeth State Park, okay? But to me, the part that really caught my eye was his theory about what happened. It is supposed that 2 low white women left the neighborhood about the same time. I don't think you can get away with making these types of accusations in the paper anymore. But anyway, But again, these people are seriously skilled, an engineer and a blacksmith. So, and this is one of 7 runaway slave ads that I found published by Montgomery Bell. Okay. One of his 7 is looking for 7 people who have run away. So, you know, at one time he was probably owned more slaves than any other individual in Tennessee, 300 or 400. And many of you may know that over the course of his life, he reversed. And by the end of his life, he was sending his slaves, the ones that he could send, to Liberia and giving the money to resettle them. And when he died, he wanted this process continued, and it was not continued.
I have a question.
Yes.
Is it more likely that they were like colored mulatto, they probably passed for white?
Yes.
If they were seen as a couple with the 2 white women, that happened all the time. And then eventually they became white in the census. They were light enough that they could pass. That's what I got.
Yes.
So people wouldn't pick up on them that they were slaves, but that they were a white couple.
Yes. One of the things I don't know, nor will I ever know, is how much time passed between these people turning up missing and the ad running. Was it weeks? Because I became, as I went on and read more about this, it became more obvious to me that it wasn't like the next day, because it would take a few days for them to even notice. Where's so, you know? Yes.
In the last couple that had yellow,
Yeah.
I mean, I know that's like competitive, but, you know, New Mexico, we have that for Native American terms. So you're saying that light skin,
Light colored mulatto boys meaning that they could pass for white.
but is that what yellow means?
Yellow means the same thing as
Very,
some
very light
plantation.
skin.
But
Mhm.
they probably passed with the white women, they probably were couples. They probably moved somewhere they'd never been before, and people accepted them as a white couple.
Light skin also means mixed race.
Yes.
They were light colored mulattoes, that's the key for me.
Now, this is one I found this ran several times. I think it was 1835, but the reason I found this fascinating is because Elizabethton, Tennessee is about as far in East Tennessee as you can go. And again, it's a part of the state where people say, we didn't really do slavery. Well, read this and figure out what this man's profession was. Oh, different.
I'm intrigued by how many analytical and mechanical skills these people have.
Yeah.
And the fact that they would be quoted as being intelligent when all other evidence points to white supremacy in most cases in slavery.
Yeah.
And for them to comment on the value of their intelligence was very intriguing to me. Why do you think they did that, just to show that they are, when they print these ads saying that the person was like an engineer or
Well,
likened to a
the most common profession when there's a profession announced, a skill, is carpenter. Carpenter, plasterer, painter, stonemason. And I'll talk about this later. What that indicates is that they were farmed out, because there's no way you can have that much work for one person. That means they were farmed out to a construction company and they built houses for someone else. But let me go ahead and finish these, and we'll talk about that in a second. This is really interesting. This is 1835, if memory serves.
How well, it covers the whole country.
Mm-hmm. Okay,
Yeah.
this is, first of all, this person I had heard of. I had heard of this person before. He's associated with the Tipton Haynes Historic Site in Johnson City. Although the people who run the Tipton Haynes Historic Site in Johnson City had never heard of this. But what this indicates is that Dr. Joseph Powell was a slave trader. May have done it on the side, but what exactly is the business he's in? He's in the business of buying slaves, probably in East Tennessee, moving to West Tennessee, where they're sold for more money. General rule is the further west and south you went, the more valuable slaves were. Somebody did the dirty job of moving them, and that's what he did. This ad didn't run one time, it ran about 8 times. So but he lists references. We can assume that these are people who he'd done this for. We can also assume that he had a business relationship with a bank in Decatur, Alabama, which probably financed his operation. This is a small-time person. Later we'll talk about a man named Isaac Franklin, who was a huge slave trader who moved large numbers of slaves from Virginia and Maryland to New Orleans and Natchez, probably 20 times more than this man did. But again, this is again, and as I'm looking at this, I'm like, wow, there's not much about this in the Tennessee history books, but this is how Joseph Powell surveyed some of 1835.
Okay, by then, Adam Huntsman was very prominent. He was a congressman.
Oh,
He beat Davy Crockett. Led Crockett to go to Texas. Ephraim Foster, there was an Ephraim Foster who was the Secretary of State of Tennessee, I think pre-Civil War. So that could be him or his father. So these are prominent
people.
Folks.
Well, that's why I'm glad to have this audience. 8th grade, when I speak to 8th grade middle school teachers, they're not going to notice that. But and just wait till you see some of the names. I have an ad later that lists several governors. Yes, sir.
The economic situation at this time, the soil in the East was giving out cotton and tobacco.
Yeah.
And so there's a surplus of slaves, but they're expanding in Mississippi and Louisiana and East Texas. And that's the reason for the movement of the slaves through.
But I'm fascinated by the percentage, 2%. Okay, kind of like a real estate agent.
The
But
banking relationships at the bottom too, I thought.
yeah, what that means is you got to have a bank. You're showing up at you're buying someone's enslaved property and moving it. You got to have that. You're going to have some money changing hands. You got to have a bank. But anyway, to me, this is interesting because it reflects. I think this reflects East to West Tennessee, not necessarily because this ad wouldn't have run in the Tennessee newspapers if he's trying to reach Virginia slaveholders. No, he's trying to reach Tennessee slaveholders, and so this is an East to West Tennessee movement. These next two I'm going to show you are very cut and dry. There's nothing tricky about. These are also not ads. These are little articles. Please read this one. This was from 1849, Nashville newspaper. This guy named Dillingham was arrested. Today we would describe this act as trying to help slaves escape. Okay, now just understand, newspapers were part of the slave institution. Therefore, in the opinion of the newspapers, this was called kidnapping. But he was trying to help slaves escape. He was arrested. I noted this when I found it, and then a few weeks later, I found this. What happened to this guy?
Well, I was actually wondering whether Dillingham was helping them escape or stealing them to resell.
No. Dillingham was from Cincinnati. Got inspired by something he read. I don't know. But this was a bizarre stroke of luck as a researcher to found that Dillingham died in state prison. Now for the interesting question. What do they do with his body? Where is it now? Where was this? First of all, where was the state prison in 1850? Yeah, basically the corner of Charlotte and like 15th. Where was the paupers' prison? Paved over. This guy's dead body is probably under Charlotte Avenue right now. No historic marker, no mention in any Tennessee book or magazine that I have ever seen. Okay, again, I felt like as I was doing this, there's a book here, okay? And, but I did Google him and find that he is mentioned there's a whole different world of abolitionist literature, and you'll find him mentioned in it. He's a hero of the abolitionist world, but to this day, not considered important enough to even note in Tennessee history. So,
Excuse me, sir. So that indicates that we may have had something similar to the Underground Railroad here in Tennessee.
yeah,
Or some type of connection to the.
yes. Well, Underground, I think this man, yes. But I'm afraid it didn't work too. I think this guy, something happened to inspire him to try to do it, and he got caught. And I.
Which river was he trying to cross? Ohio?
Oh, Cumberland, I bet.
Cumberland?
Was it 1830?
He's going north.
1850.
He's going north toward
Yes.
Ohio. Say to get on the other side of Ohio to be safe.
You know, I think it's the Cumberland. I think it happened locally, which raises another question. There's so many things. Did they search wagons? Okay, I think if someone saw a vehicle that they weren't minivans with tinted windows with what appeared to be African Americans, they could stop and say, "Did these people have papers?" I think. Yes, ma'am.
My thought on this is that they're hiding the fact that this man was murdered, and they're using a public health scare
Yeah.
search for runaway slaves or abolitionists by saying that there's a cholera outbreak. And it's really interesting because it's not hidden language in a lot of ways. So I read it as this man was murdered while he was in prison, and they're using the cholera outbreak or supposed cholera outbreak to search for other people like him and to say, oh, he's dead, somehow involving the cholera. That's what I thought for now.
Well, I don't know. We'd have to dig up his body, which we don't know where it is.
It is peculiar that they feel the necessity to point out there he really is a cholera.
Well, it goes to
A
your
large
question.
number that attacked them.
Yeah.
It also goes to your question is, did they search the wagon? Because it gives them a reason to say so-called search.
But one thing that became clear to me the more I researched it is there was a lot of searching going on in those days. There was a lot of random. There's a lot of random. Do you have your? Where's your papers? And yes. Okay. Now, going back to the slave trading, before I show you this one, I want to tell you something.
I wonder who this guy right there was next time.
Okay, can I get to this okay. Before I get to this, I want to point, if you read a lot of the literature about the Old South, especially the Romantic literature, you will be told that slave traders were looked down upon by the general public. That if so-and-so was a slave trader, their daughter would be scorned or something. You'll read this. There's several implications in the movie Gone with the Wind that this is true. Okay? It's crap. It's a lie. It's not true. It's utter lies. Nathan Bedford Forrest was elected a city councilman in Memphis, and he was a slave, and he was a very prominent slave trader. But this ad proves beyond a shadow of a doubt that it's not true. Glover and Boyd was a slave trader. Read the list of references introducing themselves. Founder of the Nashville and Chattanooga Railroad, as you know. But even that, he's still the most important person on this list. If any of you have this list of references, Andy, perhaps you do. You're the only person in this room that might come close to having references that start with the current governor and the former governor. You might be able to pull that off. I don't think anyone else can. It then consists of a banker named Dr. John Shelby, Dyer Pearl, banker, Colonel V.K. Stevenson, founder of the Nashville and Chattanooga Railway, another bank, and then down here, and I'll talk about this in a second, Chancery Court, Clerk, and Master. I'll talk about them in a second. But this is an amazing list of references for an industry that, according to many, to an entire way of looking at it, was looked down upon. Well, not this, folks. Okay. So they were very prominent. This is from about 1853, and I apologize that the dates aren't here. I can assure you that every ad that's in that book is dated. When I created this PowerPoint, I was kind of moving quickly. Now, please read this one as much. I'm going to give you about a minute to read this one. There's a lot here. Only the lawyers in this room could possibly read all this stuff. But let me just say that, and I'll talk about this in a second, the most regular slave traders in the state of Tennessee were the Chancery Court Clerk and Masters, C&M. To this day, every county, I believe, has a Chancery Court Clerk and Masters. At this point, I'm looking at Judge Bennett, making sure. There was so much legalese that at some point I took my friend Judge Robert Brand out, and I kind of picked his brain about this. But the Chancery Court, have any of you unfortunately had to experience the death of a father or father-in-law where assets had to be disposed of in recent? Okay, when that happens, stuff has to be sold. The car, the house. It was the same was true then. Unless this person died with a very specific and clear will, most of the time, slaves had to be sold. Sometimes it lists the names and the ages. Sometimes it doesn't list either. In this case, it just lists the names. We don't know whether these particular slaves would have been 60, 20, or 2 years old. Yes, ma'am.
You could go back to the will.
Oh.
And then they would list in the appraisal of the slaves, so they have a value that they think they're
Yes.
worth. And then you could find out what their proper age and what they were valued at. And give you a full.
Yes. Now, when I said you can't, what I mean is from this ad. Yes. The other places you can dig, you can find. But Paul Priestley, or P. Priestley, I think I looked it up, was the Chancery Court Clerk and Master, and I think is this Montgomery County? I don't think it said, this is Montgomery County. Yeah, this is Clarksville somewhere, yeah. So I found 165 different times when Chancery Court Clerk and Masters would run ads saying they're about to sell slaves or they did sell slaves. The other thing that could cause these types of things to happen are lawsuits. And then the third thing that could cause this type of thing to happen is if someone got overextended, they borrowed money using slaves as escrow, and then the price of cotton goes down, can't make the payments, slaves get auctioned off. But these types of things happen all the time, and I have an entire chart. The back of my book has several appendices. One is a 56-page appendix that lists every runaway slave ad that I found with information on it. The other, a second of them lists all these Chancery Court sales. This all sounds logical, but I will tell you about one conversation I had during this. I called the Chancery Court Clerk and Master from my home county, and I asked her. She was dumbfounded by this. I said, now you know that before 1865, a big part of your job was selling slaves. And he goes, what are you talking about? And you might say, well, how naive. All this has kind of been dumped from our collective understanding of Bill Purcell, you've heard of him maybe, told me he could not believe that the government of Nashville, he said, I'd never heard this. The government of Nashville and 26 slaves? Where'd you find that, Bill? He asked me, and I said, it was on the top of the front page of the newspaper. But he doesn't look up microfilm. And so it's just a part of our, and then one more I'd like to show you, and then I want to get to the regular PowerPoint, is this one right here. First of all, look at the date, 1863. This is late. There are slaves being sold in a runaway slave ad, 1863. Does anyone know where Mouse Creek Depot is? McMinn County. It is now known as Nyota. It's in East Tennessee, and yes, slavery, let me explain. The Emancipation Proclamation did not apply to Tennessee. Don't think it did. 6 months after the Emancipation Proclamation, they were still selling slaves in Tennessee, and they were still enforcing the slave laws. What's interesting about this, a couple of things interesting about this. One is that my theory is there was a direct rail connection between Richmond, Virginia, and East Tennessee. I think as the war got worse, people in Richmond were putting their slaves on trains, sending them down here and getting what they could for them. They were literally selling them off the train. Okay? Curious, what became of Mouse Creek Depot? Still standing. It's the Nyota train station. It's pretty beat up. I called the mayor of Nyota. Yes, they have a mayor. And I said, where's your office? And she goes, it's in the train station. And I said, do you know that you were in a building that may have been one of the last places in Tennessee that slaves were sold? She was dumbfounded. Where did you find this? I'm like, newspaper. Look at this came from the Knoxville newspaper, I think. So there's a lot of information there. Okay. Now I'm going to get onto the regular PowerPoint. I wanted to immerse you, kind of give you some idea of why I got so wrapped up in this. Maybe now you understand. General points about these advertisements. There were no profitable newspapers that refused to publish slave-related advertising. It would be like refusing to run department store advertising. Of course, I realize today newspapers don't have any advertising, but when I worked for the Tennessean, there's no way that we wouldn't have run advertisements that came in. Lord, when I worked at the Nashville scene, we had 9 pages of escort ads. Did y'all know that? Then the internet came along. There goes that, you know. This is on film, isn't it? It's a true story. Just, you know, I'm going to stop. Sometimes it's best to stop. I'm going to make 6 main points about slavery. Now, listen, the point you brought up, ma'am, was a good one. This book is about what I was able to determine about slavery simply by looking at newspapers and almost entirely newspaper ads. I didn't spend a lot of time reading wills or diaries because I'd still be doing this. In fact, I'd be doing this until I die. But there was so much that's in the newspapers that sort of surprised me, and I thought might need to be out there, that I thought there was a book here, and I think I was right. First of all, in the degree to which slavery was embedded, you hear this a lot, and it's true. Only 1 in 4 households owned slaves in the state of Tennessee in 1860, which is interesting. Okay, if the Civil War was about slavery and only 1 in 4 households owned slaves, why did we fight the war? And I think the main thing is you got to realize that 1 in 4 reflects a lot. Slavery was deeply connected to law enforcement, law, the judicial system, agriculture, industry, transportation, religion. Every stage of Tennessee's culture and economy was tied to slavery. Interesting point. It may be that only 1 in 4 white households owned slaves, but a quick look through old newspapers makes it very clear that many households and businesses leased slaves. And the trail of following this is much more difficult. But for example, if a slaveholder owned 40 slaves it might be financially beneficial for him or her to farm out 20 of them, to be carpenters, to work here, to work for someone else, to work in a factory. And that happened a lot. In fact, if you look in the newspapers, by the 1830s, these are the main slave-related advertising you'll find in Nashville. There were entire, and I know this sounds bizarre, you know what a temp agency is? There were temp agencies that run lists of jobs that needed slaves, and that's what they did. There were a couple that I recognized, and some of them would run ads that would be like run way down the column. Yes, sir.
These publications, were they primarily weekly or daily?
Almost all newspapers that came out in Tennessee before the Civil War were weekly. I want to point out something about them. The Tennessee State Library and Archives, somewhere along the way, sent out an APB to the state that said, we want your old newspapers. Gordon, what, in the 1950s? Early 50s. They got all that they could. Couldn't get them all. Most of them are gone. For some reason in Nashville, we're lucky we have almost all the Nashville newspapers. Shelbyville, not so lucky. We have like a tiny number. You might say, well, who cares about Shelbyville? Shelbyville's tiny. No, it wasn't. Shelbyville was bigger than Nashville in 1830. Okay, Murfreesboro, there's not very much. So I dug through everything I could find, but we were missing a lot. The most bizarre thing that they have down there is, I think, a complete collection of the newspapers from a place called Randolph, Tennessee. Where's Randolph? It's not there anymore. It's a ghost town on the Mississippi River. We have 3 years of runaway slave ads published in a place that doesn't exist anymore, that literally fell into the Mississippi River. And it's like, this is weird. It's like the history of a place that was kind of like never there. So it has nothing to do with whether it was a big community or not, but like tiny numbers from Sparta. But, law enforcement was geared to arrest runaway slaves. They arrested runaways all the time and ran ads pointing out that they had arrested runaways because state law required them to. These runaways remained in jail until they were claimed. While there, they were set to work, and you'd see them all over the county in chains, just like you see. Well, but prisoners are put to work. But just, you might see the chain gang. A couple of points about this. State law required the sheriff, to do this. Sheriffs in East Tennessee were at least as likely, if not more, to have runaways than Middle and West. Why? Because a lot of slaves from Georgia and Alabama would say, I'm going to cut through East Tennessee because I've heard there's not as many slaves, which might backfire because they might stick out more. After 12 months, they were sold at auction. And the money went to the general fund of the county, I think.
Like unclaimed property.
Yes.
A lot of this stuff is really still happening. According to Noam Chomsky,
Yeah.
we're still having some of those, we're paid slaves now. I don't know if everybody's familiar with Noam Chomsky, but
A sheriff, and again, you got to realize, most of the time my audience consists of teachers, and a lot of them are from East Tennessee, and a lot of this shocks them to the core because we do downplay the slave history of East Tennessee. But even in East Tennessee, if you were a sheriff, you could no more be against slavery than you would be to be in favor of legalized crack today. If you're in favor of legalized crack, you cannot be a sheriff. Okay, I have a friend who's the sheriff of McMinn County, and I kind of pointed this out to him. Slavery was embedded in the legal system. This is something I talked about earlier. The most consistent slave traders in Tennessee were the Chancery Court clerk and masters. This ad here, I learned a lot about early Tennessee history through this process. This is a slave sale in a place called Smith's Crossroads. Thanks to Google, you can find where these places, in some cases you can find where these places are. When this ad ran in 1850, the county seat of Ray County was called Washington. It was on the river. Dayton did not exist yet by name. It was called Smith's Crossroads. So curious enough, there were at least one slave sale in Dayton before that was even the county seat. Here's another Chancery Court sale, and there are many, many of these in the book, 160 or so that I reference, and some of them that I have there, but it's got their names, and this one would have happened in Franklin. Separation of slave families, I don't think anyone would deny that it happened, but there's a lot of evidence in newspapers that it happened all the time through 2 or 3 methods. One is the runaway slave ad will often say that they're heading somewhere, which doesn't seem to make any sense if you look at it first. A slave ran away in Montgomery County, which is known as Clarksville today, and seems to be heading for Polk County. Well, why would they do that? Well, you can guess. And we know that a lot of these, we can tell from the way it's being reported, being announced, that when they're having these courthouse sales, that they're not going to make an effort to keep families together, because sometimes they do. And sometimes you can tell that they're selling them together, but then a lot of times you can't tell, and we can assume that they weren't. This is an interesting ad that I found not in a Tennessee newspaper, but in a magazine that was published nationally. It's it's a business publication, and it came out around right before the Civil War, and it actually lists the amount of money that slaves were sold for in Lebanon, Tennessee at a recent auction. And I found these numbers fascinating. First of all, 60-year-old man, $100. I hate to break it to the 60-year-old men in the room, but you're not worth a lot. No, I shouldn't say it that way. I'm sure you can hear that enough from your spouse. But $100, okay? Judy, 30-year-old woman, $905. Lewis, 15-year-old boy, $1,406. Wow. The amounts vary so wildly, and you have to kind of think about slavery and what it means. But there's one here, Emmeline, 25-year-old female, comma, unsound, $700. What does unsound mean? That's what I thought, but it turns out that's not what it means. It doesn't mean touched in the head. She can't have children. And that would double her value, okay? But anyway, one of the things that's obvious about this, there's no indication here, at least that Emmeline was sold with anyone else. Now, and the reason I say that is here, Jane, who's 26, there is an indication that she was sold with her 2 small children. But Emmeline, it just says she was sold by herself. So I think Emmeline was sold by herself. Emmeline's only 7. She's not exactly 27. So, yes, sir?
What did you say unsound meant?
I think it means she couldn't have children. You have to understand, these are educated theories. A lot of this came from books I read. And by the way, almost all the good books on the history of the slave trade are out of print. It's just because people don't read a lot of these books. Yes, ma'am?
Oh, they put children separately, but a lot of times when someone purchased them, they purchase them together. Like Emmeline probably she could be a good house servant.
Yes.
So when she didn't need a mother over 4 or 5, they usually gave them a separate value. Those that were younger than 4 or 5, they sold them with their mom, like you see the lady with 2 children. So I bet both her children were under 4. But when a person was going to buy them, it could have been that they were bought by who were purchasing them together. But they always put a separate price on the child if they were over a certain age, because they could do little things around the house to help out. I've seen that a lot.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of wheels, and even when they're sold, they're priced separately. The girls and boys that are a certain age are priced separately from the parents. A lot of times they were bought together later on, but they're separated out.
One thing I will tell you, and I don't know if I have it in the PowerPoint, but I should point out, in Tennessee, there was no law requiring that a woman be sold with her children, even her small children, until about 1859. In the early 1850s, there was a law that required a woman to be sold with her small children in Mississippi and Louisiana, but not Tennessee. Tennessee didn't pass that law until the very last minute. I just want to point this out because, in other words, Tennessee's laws were actually crueler, at least in this regard, than they were in Mississippi and Louisiana. And yet people will seem to want to think that it's the opposite. Now, the reason I know that there were proposals to change this law in the early 50s is I found articles, I talk about this in the book, I found articles in the early 1850s where a legislator had proposed a law similar to one in other states, and the newspapers would say it's a bad law. And so that wouldn't pass. Another point, and I'm trying to This is point 3 about slavery that I can't. Agriculture wasn't the only thing dependent on slavery. So was construction, industry, the development of our infrastructure, transportation, and banking. I'm going to go through these one at a time. Several railroads would hire slave labor. This one in particular even tells the terms. When they built the Cleveland-Chattanooga Railroad, $180 per year, clothe and lose all lost time except runaway time. If they run away, they're not going to pay. Or we will pay $20 per month of the owners looking all lost time. Some of you who are... But what's interesting is $180 a month. That's pretty good. That's a lot of money is what I'm saying. So if you had a $600 slave in 3 years, and yes. Now I need to point something out. If you look at the slave narratives that the federal government did and that Fisk did that preceded them, and you read, some of them will say that some of the people they interviewed became free before the war and were able to actually buy their freedom through an arrangement like this. Not all slaveholders did it, of course, but some slaveholders said if you work here for 5 years, you can buy your freedom.
It looks like bonding and insurance.
Yes.
Is that what I'm looking at right there? Basically, a form of what today,
Yes.
the term we would call insured and bonding.
Yes.
Insured and bonding.
Mm-hmm.
Basically what that's outlining.
I think so. I had these from 3 or 4 different railroads, but by the way,
Well, the
You still
NCNC
assert your indemnities even if the person runs away.
yes.
So that's what it symbolizes to me.
This means that the ad ran 4 times, by the way. I eventually figured out. The NC and St. L, there's a couple of those that come up that they hired slave labor when they built the...
They owned slave labor in 1945.
They also, really, but they also lease them, and there's ads in the book. Construction, I think I showed you all this earlier. This proves that there were carpenters who were slaves, and so does, and here's another one. But the fact that somebody was a carpenter, if you were a carpenter, you were farmed out. I mean, you weren't trained to be a carpenter because, you know, how much work do I need done in this house? You were farmed out. You all know who Ida B. Wells was. Yes. When you visit her birthplace in Holly Springs, they tell you that it was built by her father, who was a carpenter. Now,
What year was that?
what was her father? She was, well, he would have been about 18, let me see, well, he would have been a slave until the Civil War ended. But when I first heard that, I was like, okay, maybe, but now I'm certain, oh, okay, that's very logical. A lot of slaves were carpenters, and he built that house, which is still standing in Mississippi. I found a few of these. These are ads run by companies, factories, hiring slave labor. And just so you'll know, these are slaves. These are not free Negroes we're not hiring, because they wouldn't, and I eventually became certain of this. They just didn't, the word slave almost never appears, except in runaway slave ads. That's kind of strange, but this one is a bagging factory, and this is a bagging factory, and this is they made iron materials.
Is that probably because you can't exploit free people?
I just think it was a euphemism. But there were so many, but one of the reasons I know it is because some of the railroads hired large numbers, and you can tell by the terms that it says that we're not hiring free blacks, because free blacks had so many restrictions on what they could do. They you know. But one of the things about this that makes you wonder too is, what does the fact that they were able to hire slave labor mean about what they paid white labor? So, it means, look, if you don't straighten up and work harder, I'm going to replace you with a slave. It's like, it was a way to keep wages down, I think, you know, but no one will ever look at this aspect of it. But if you have a factory where there's some people who are slaves and some are not, I would think it would keep the wages down, but that's, yes.
Ida Wells was born in
1860.
She was born in 1860.
Yeah, she was like 2 years and then she... Okay, here's one that I found, I think, 6 steamboats that hired slave labor. This one was called the Red Rover. And these people did everything from work as porters to work as deckhands to firemen. They did all sorts of jobs. To me, the interesting question about this is, wouldn't you be afraid that this person would run away? working on a steamboat, traveling all over the South. And I eventually came to the conclusion that there were two reasons why they wouldn't run away. One is because their families are back here in Nashville. The other is, did you teach your slave to swim? No way. Okay. And so, why would you? There also, you will find ads for insurance. When you farmed out a slave to work in a faraway place, possibly dangerous, they were insured. So that if something happened, this is the ad that you were telling about. Well, but at one time, the NC in St. L, this was an NC in St. L, Nashville and Chattanooga. Curious ad, 500 Negroes, those are slaves, 1,000 Irish laborers. These are immigrants. Donald Trump would not like this ad, okay? Half of the 2,000 people you're hiring are immigrants. Leaving the interesting question, what is a native-born laborer? That's what I know. That's our current, it's a white guy, okay? It's a white guy who's from here, I guess, somebody who fought in the Mexican-American, or in just a normal, so 1/4 of these jobs went to a white, to a non-immigrant, non-slave. Wow. And this was 1850.
But the terms and conditions were probably a little bit different.
Yes.
They were more indentured servants versus the Negro would be a perpetual.
Oh, well, these people may have been chained together. I wish we knew more about what the different jobs that people did were and what the skills were.
A lot of the Irish people went on to be business owners after a while
Mhm.
and owning their own ship.
What we know is a fact, Terry, you can nod and shake your head on this one, that there were so many Irishmen working on the NC and St. L, especially on the tunnel, that there is the remains of a cemetery on the hill halfway between Cowan and Sewanee somewhere. I couldn't find it. They wouldn't let me on the property. They have signs that say, do not go any further or we will shoot you. If you're looking,
And they mean it up there too, boy.
Yes. So there was a notable Irish population in the area of Cowan/Sewanee when they were digging the tunnel. And one of the things that has been told to me about this, and you got to kind of put your eye in and out of businessmen. If you lost an Irish laborer, good Lord, it's 10 till 11. If you lost an Irish laborer, there was no financial problem. If the railroad killed a slave, there was a financial obligation. So to a certain degree, it was okay to lose the Irish workers. I have been talking for way too long, and I'm almost out of time, and I've got to keep moving. I talked about banks earlier, and I showed you this ad. People need to understand how on the eve of the Civil War, there were about 4 million slaves in the United States at an average value of $800, $3.2 billion, which is a lot of money. It is, in fact, as according to a book that apparently came out a few years ago, the value of slaves exceeded the value of all railroads and all factories in the entire United States combined. And so, why did we fight the Civil War? Well, if those slaves had suddenly been free, what would have happened to every bank? Every bank, not just in the South, but in the entire United States. It would be like, how many of you have a house payment? I do. Are you kidding me? Some of you don't have a house payment. That's not right. It'd be like if everyone who had a house payment just walked away from the house all at the same time. How long would First Tennessee Bank last if we all walked away? How long would any bank last? Banking was absolutely in on it. State and local governments had a very comfortable relationship with slavery. I guess I may end with this. This is interesting. There's a man named Eddie Weeks who runs the Tennessee General Assembly Library, and he and I dug out Tennessee law and found this one that was written, we think, in the mid-1830s, but this was the law in Tennessee. No person shall in this state write, print, paint, draw, or engrave, or aid and abet in writing, printing, painting, drawing, or engraving on paper, parchment, linen, metal, or other substance with a view to its circulation, any paper, essay, verses, pamphlet, book, painting, drawing, or engraving calculated to excite discontent, insurrection, or rebellion amongst the slaves. Now, so if you wrote an op-ed piece against slavery, you went to jail according to this law. As I understand it, the book Uncle Tom's Cabin could not be circulated according to this law. I mean, seriously, was that book meant to excite rebellion amongst the slaves? Well, it's up to the judge. I think so. So I say all this because I think that we overplay Tennessee's abolitionist movement quite a bit. This was the law. The reality was if you tried to help slaves escape, you ended up at state prison and hopefully you survived your term. Okay? And but this was the law. And this law, by the way, wasn't passed until the 1830s. I think the Nat Turner Rebellion had something to do with it. But this was not the law in the 1820s because we had an abolitionist newspaper in the 1820s. Slaves had no standing in court and could not testify against or bring charges against a slaveholder. It was legal to beat a slave. It was, however, illegal to beat the slave of another person. That's in the law. You think, what a weird law. No, it's not. If I take a baseball bat and go out and dent your car, I'm in trouble, but I can beat my car up all I want. Okay, and that's kind of, but it is interesting that it has that expression. It is illegal to beat the slave of another person. I'm like, oh, okay. The state did occasionally use slave labor. Local governments used slave labor. Perhaps this had been known. I had never seen this before, but yes, they did use slave labor when they built the Tennessee State Capitol to work on the quarry. And one of them died. And I don't know if this has ever been in any book. Has this ever been in any of the official histories of the Tennessee State Capitol? Because I'd never heard this, but somebody did die. We don't know the name of the person. We do, however, know his slaveholder, Baldwin, okay? And I think when you broke your spine in 1864, you were done, okay? So on at least one occasion, the state did use slaves as a fundraising device. In the 1836 lottery, it lists slaves as being given away as a lottery prize. That came as news to Eddie Weeks. The city of Nashville, and this is one of the things in my book that is not new. This has been published before in four different books. Most recent one by Bobby Lovett, but it was published in his book as early as 1957. The government of Nashville bought 24 slaves. And if you go to the Metro Archives and ask Ken Feith, he'll show you they have this book, a big log book, and it even has the long descriptions of who they were and all their identifying marks, where they came from, etc. On at least two occasions, the slaves owned by the Nashville government tried to run away, and the mayor of Nashville, part of his job was to run the Runaway Slave Ad. So two of the former mayors of Nashville bought runaway slave ads. We don't know what happened to these 26 slaves. I asked David Briley 3 times to appoint a commission to find out. You might say, why can't I find out? Well, because I don't really have access to the Metro. Anyway, maybe Cooper will do it. We'll see. Slave trading. Have y'all had enough, or do y'all want me to go a little further?
Keep going.
All right, keep going. 1850. I'll talk a little bit about slave trading and how it operated in Tennessee. First of all, let me explain something that's a little bit of a point. International slave trade was made illegal in 1808. That doesn't mean there weren't ships that occasionally came through, but the purchase of slaves from Africa brought into Charleston and Mobile was made illegal in 1808. Virginia and Maryland and Carolinas went along with this. Why? Why would they go along with this? Because they knew that this meant their slaves would become worth more as the years went by. Okay, and so Tennessee did have a say, because Tennessee would have been a state, but most of the places that would be importing states weren't states yet. So they had no say. Alabama had no say, Texas had no say, because many of these places weren't there yet. However, and so because of this, textbooks will say wrongly that the slave trade was outlawed in 1808. There's several textbooks which, in their attempt to try to oversimplify history, will say the slave trade was made illegal in 1808. That's a lie. The international slave trade was, but the interstate slave trade was absolutely remained legal. And that's what I learned a lot about. And the most interesting example of the interstate slave trade, and this is something that has been written about. Smithsonian Magazine had a cover story that talked about this a few months ago. there was a man named Isaac Franklin, and he resided in Sumner County, but he had a very interesting business which purchased slaves in Virginia and Maryland, moved them to Natchez and New Orleans, and sold them at twice what he would pay for them. The trick, obviously, was there's a number of tricks to this. It's a horrifying profession because the slaves didn't want to go. And so he would have had to have, there's all sorts of horror stories that do exist about how you had to forcibly force the slaves. What they usually do is attack them at night when they were sleeping and put the chains on them and get them in, and then and only then they realize what's happening. But they would be moved to a Franklin and Armfield building in Alexandria, Virginia. Curiously enough, it's still there. It's an now museum. I took my wife and my kids there. This is my idea of a vacation, not theirs. And we got to go, but you can go to the basement, even though at that time the Franklin and Armfield owned the entire block. The main building is still there, and it's still got chains and stuff in the basement. But this interesting point: how did they move most of the slaves from Alexandria, Virginia, to New Orleans? This Nashville Scene did a cover story about this, and it implied that most of them were taken by Coffles. 1/10 of them were taken by Coffles. 9 out of 10 were taken by ship. Franklin and Armfield owned a ship. Their business was so good they bought a second, and then a third, and then a fourth, and then a fifth. They had 5 ships, and they would move slaves from Alexandria to New Orleans, and then move cotton from New Orleans to Alexandria. And the reason we know how big this company was because even then, you had to write down the names of all souls on board on the open seas. And so we know how many people this company moved, and it's in the 13 to 15,000 range. This is a very large business that advertised heavily, and they usually ran this standard issue ad all over Virginia and Maryland. And the way it would work is a Franklin and Armfield slave trader would turn up and he would say, "Ma'am, I was just coming to see if you have anyone you want to sell this month." "Well, not this month, you try next month." And they would get regular slave traders knocking on their doors. And eventually somebody would say, "Yeah, we need to liquidate, we need to sell." And they might take 20 and take them to Alexandria and then take them to New Orleans. Now there's all sorts of, there's articles and books about Franklin Armfield. I'm going to ask y'all this. As far as the slave is concerned, what were they more likely to survive? The boat ride to New Orleans or the walk to New Orleans? I would have thought it was the boat ride. It was the walk. The boat ride exposed them to the New Orleans climate instantly, and they would die of diseases. They generally found that people were more likely to survive the walk. But think about this walk. 500 people, 300 people, walking in chains down Highway 70, spending the night, but this was a reality, and they would have had to come through Nashville. I think when they would come through Nashville, they would stop at Mr. Franklin's. I think Mr. Franklin would take 1 or 2 Coffles a year and time it so that they were going past his cotton farm in Sumner County and could work it while on the way. So, but this was a big, big business, and which left a couple of fortunes. Mr. Armfield's, when he was in his 50s, he retired and married a young lady named Adelicia Acklin. And she outlived him, but she inherited his money. And a lot of the money that went into Belmont came from his estate. And when I spoke at Belmont, to their credit, they asked me to speak immediately. But after I made the talk, someone raised their hand and they said, "Look behind you." And I looked behind me, and Isaac Franklin's painting was hanging over me the whole time. He said his eyes had been following you the whole time. Mr. Armfield, also from Tennessee, and he built Beersheba Springs, the place there. And he was one of the original board members of the University of the South at Sewanee. And how many of y'all have ever hiked the Perimeter Trail? Well, one of the points on the Perimeter Trail is named from him. So these were very, very wealthy people. Franklin and Armfield may have been the most successful slave trading firm in American history in terms of the interstate slave trade. They were even much larger than Nathan Forrest, and he was big too. Nashville had an entire industry of professional slave traders. These traders came and went None of them seem to stay in business more than 3 or 4 years. However, they advertise heavily. It's like starting about the 1830s, you'll see these names and they come up over and then all of a sudden they're gone. But I think the places where they operated remain the same. You'd have a business, and then I think people would do the slave trading profession for 3 or 4 years and retire. Just like they could only, you could make a lot of money and then you would retire and say, I don't ever want to do this again. And by the way, that's what Forrest did. He retired from the slave trading business about 2 years before the Civil War happened. But you can see these ads. This is okay, let's see. R.J. Lyles. A lot of times these people, there's R.J. Lyles running 5 different ads. Sometimes they would run one big ad. Sometimes they chose to just run small ones. The best known one of this time that you'll read most about is a man named Reese W. Porter. And he's the one who mentions fancy girls. If this presentation hasn't disturbed you enough, it will now. This is a Reese W. Porter ad that actually says this. I'm not making this up. Be in a hurry or Christmas will come and find you without a Negro, and you will have to hire again at higher prices than ever. That's just interesting. Okay, but no, there's Anissa, and this is, look, I researched everything I could find. Everywhere I found, this is what they said fancy girls were. Okay. The story of how slavery ended in Tennessee is very complex. I didn't do it justice. This could and should be another book, but don't look at me. I'm not doing another book anytime soon. And when the Civil War began, slavery continued as before. Tennessee was exempt from the Emancipation Proclamation, specifically exempt. And so it in itself did not end slavery anywhere in Tennessee officially. However, and this gets really confusing, it appears as if, based on newspapers, that the Emancipation Proclamation did end slavery in Nashville, and here's why. You know those ads that the sheriff had to run whenever they had a runaway? We went from 5 to 7 to 10 to 37 in one 4-page issue. The law required them to have a separate ad for every person. And so this became quite a burden. By September of 1862, they had one issue of the Nashville newspaper with 37 different ads. Next issue, none. Next issue, none. Never again. It went from 37 to 0, and there never was published again. September, or just, we're not going to do this anymore. By that time, the Union Army had taken over Nashville. The Emancipation Proclamation had been issued. I think the general just said no. And at that point, they may have said, we're going to build Fort Negley. I don't know. But it appears as if slavery as an institution just collapsed around September of 62. But months later, as y'all remember, 9 months later, they're still selling slaves in Athens, in Sevierville, right next to Dolly Parton's new statue. Yeah. And so slavery continued. And from that point on, it seems like slavery ended as the Union Army advanced, because at least based on the newspaper evidence. Brownlow's Knoxville Whig, a lot of people know who Brownlow was. He was our Unionist governor, a very popular man in his time. That's being sarcastic. Brownlow was a Unionist, but he was not but he was not anti-slave. His newspaper ran slavery ads just like all the others. And so slavery was abolished, and this is a fact, but almost no one knows this. Slavery was done away with in Tennessee officially on February 22nd, 1865 by statewide referendum. I think Tennessee was the only state that technically did away with slavery by statewide referendum. The 13th Amendment did not end slavery here. The Emancipation did not end slavery here. This did. Now, I don't know how many people would have been allowed to vote on February 22nd, 1865, because women, y'all can't vote. You know that, right? Okay. Being funny there. But if you sympathize, you had to take an oath that not only were you not sympathetic to the Confederacy, the oath had to say that you will rejoice in the defeat of the Confederacy. It was a bizarre oath written by, I think, Andrew Johnson. But not a lot of people in Middle Tennessee would have gone. So I don't know what voter turnout was like, but this ended slavery officially in Tennessee.